$20. That was the price of a human life in the mud-choked streets of a Colorado mining camp in 1874. Silas didn't buy her because he wanted a companion. He bought her because the man dragging her by the hair was making too much damn noise, and Silas had a headache. It was supposed to be a simple transaction, a momentary lapse into pity. But when they reached his isolated cabin, the first words out of her mouth stopped his dead heart cold. The settlement didn't have a name, just a collection of canvas tents and rough-hewn timber thrown together beside a trickling creek that ran brown with mining runoff. It smelled of wet ash, stale whiskey, and unwashed desperation. Silas hated it. He came down from the timberline twice a year, once in the spring to trade his winter pelts, and once in late autumn to buy salt coffee and enough powder to keep him alive until the spring thaw. He was a large man, built like the pines he lived among, thick, weathered, and silent. A jagged scar ran from his left ear down to his collarbone, a parting gift from a grizzly 3 winters prior. He wore buckskin, shiny with bear grease, and a heavy buffalo coat that made him look twice his size. He had just settled his account with Miller, the trading post owner, when the screaming started. It wasn't a sharp, panicked scream. It was a dull, exhausted wail. The sound of an animal that had been beaten too many times to fight back, but still felt the pain. Silas stepped out onto the muddy boardwalk, a sack of flour slung over his shoulder. In the center of the street, the mud was knee-deep. A man named Harlan, a prospector whose luck had dried up years ago, was dragging a woman through the muck. He had one fist wrapped tightly in her matted brown hair. She was stumbling, trying to keep her footing, her bare feet sliding in the freezing slurry. $50. Harlan was shouting to the miners gathering on the edges of the street. His face was red, spit flying from his lips. $50 and you can have her. She cooks, she washes, and she doesn't talk back. Who wants her? The crowd just watched. Some laughed. Some looked away, finding sudden interest in the toes of their boots. Nobody had $50, and even if they did, nobody wanted the burden of another starving mouth. The girl fell. Her knees hit the mud with a wet smack. Harlan yanked her hair, pulling her head back. She didn't cry out this time. She just squeezed her eyes shut, her face smeared with filth, waiting for the blow she knew was coming. Silas stood on the boardwalk, his jaw tightened. He didn't care about the cruelty of the world. The world was cruel to everything. Wolves ate elk alive. Winter froze men in their sleep. Men beat women in the mud. It was the natural order of a godless frontier. But the noise, the sheer, pathetic indignity of it grated against the quiet he had cultivated in his soul. He dropped the sack of flour onto the wooden boards. He stepped into the street. The mud sucked at his heavy boots, but he didn't slow. He walked straight toward Harlan. The crowd parted. They knew Silas. They knew the mountain man who spoke to no one, who killed silently and efficiently, and who brought down hides that made the trading post a fortune. Harlan saw him coming, and his shouting died in his throat. He tightened his grip on the girl's hair. "What do you want, Silas? You want her $50. Silas stopped 2 feet away. He looked down at the girl. She was young, maybe 19. Her dress was a coarse wool sack torn at the shoulder, revealing skin bruised a mottled purple and yellow. She opened her eyes. They were gray, flat, dead winter sky gray. She looked at Silas, and there was no hope in her expression, just the dull calculation of assessing a new threat. Silas reached into the heavy leather pouch at his belt. His thick, calloused fingers bypassed the silver dollars and found a heavy gold piece, a $20 double eagle. He pulled it out. The gold caught the weak afternoon sun practically glowing in the dismal street. "20, Silas said. His voice was like grinding stones, deep, rough, unused to conversation. Harlan's eyes went wide. He stared at the coin. He swallowed hard. "I said 50. She's a good worker." Silas didn't argue. He didn't haggle. He simply flipped the coin. It arced through the air and landed with a wet thwack right in the center of a mud puddle between Harlan's boots. Harlan let go of the girl, immediately dropping to his knees, his hands digging frantically into the freezing muck to find the gold. Silas didn't look at him again. He looked at the girl. She was still kneeling in the mud, staring at the spot where the coin had disappeared. "Get up," Silas said. She flinched at his voice. Then, slowly, she pushed herself to her feet. She was shivering violently, her thin frame shaking under the wet wool. She didn't look at his face. She kept her eyes on his boots. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lila," she whispered. Her voice was raspy, completely devoid of emotion. Silas turned his back on her and walked back to the boardwalk. He hoisted the flour sack over his shoulder. He walked to the hitching post where his pack mule and riding horse were tied. He didn't look back to see if she was following. When he reached the horses, he glanced over his shoulder. She was standing exactly where he had left her, shivering in the street. Silas sighed a heavy, tired sound. He walked back, grabbed her thin arm, careful to avoid the bruising, and pulled her towards the horses. He lifted her easily, tossing her onto the back of the pack mule like she weighed no more than a sack of beans. "Hold on," he grunted. He swung up onto his own horse and spurred it forward. They rode out of the camp, leaving the noise, the mud, and the stinking humanity behind. They rode for hours in silence. The trail rose sharply, winding through thick stands of ponderosa pine and scrub oak. The air grew thinner, sharper. Down in the valley it was a muddy autumn. Up here, winter had already moved in. Patches of snow clung to the shadows. The wind picked up, biting at exposed skin. Silas rode point, his broad back blocking the worst of the gale for the girl on the mule behind him. He kept waiting for her to speak, to cry, to ask where they were going, to beg him not to hurt her. Women in her position usually did one of those things. He had prepared himself to ignore it, but Lila said nothing. Silas twisted in his saddle to look back at her. She was clinging to the wooden frame of the pack saddle. Her bare feet hung down blue with cold, scraped and bleeding from where they brushed against the brush and rock bordering the narrow trail. She was shivering so hard he could hear the mule's rigging rattling, but she was staring straight ahead, her face a blank mask of endurance. "She's tough," he thought. Or she's just broken. As the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks, casting long, bruised purple shadows across the snow, Silas finally called a halt. They were still miles from his cabin, but it was getting too dark to navigate the scree field safely. He dismounted and tied the horses. He walked to the mule and reached up. Lila flinched back, her eyes wide, pulling her arms tight against her chest. Silas paused. He lowered his hands, taking a step back. "Get down," he said quietly. She scrambled off the mule, her frozen feet hitting the rocky ground. She swayed her legs, buckling slightly, but caught herself before she fell. She immediately shrank back against the mule's flank, making herself as small as possible. Silas ignored her. He gathered dry deadfall from beneath the pines. With practiced efficiency, he struck a spark from his flint and had a small hot fire blazing within minutes. He unpacked his bedroll, a heavy wool blanket, and threw it onto the ground near the fire. "Sit," he commanded, pointing to the blanket. Lila didn't move. She just stared at him. "I won't tell you twice," Silas said, his tone flat. She moved slowly, limping towards the fire. She didn't sit on the blanket. She sat on the bare, frozen dirt beside it, pulling her knees to her chest. Silas ground his teeth. He walked over, picked up the blanket, and draped it over her trembling shoulders. She stiffened, as if he had hit her, but she didn't throw it off. He walked back to his saddlebags and pulled out a tin of hardtack and a strip of dried venison jerky. He tossed them into her lap. "Eat." She stared at the food. Then she looked up at him. It was the first time she had really looked him in the eye since the street. Her gray eyes tracked his scarred face, reading the danger, assessing the man. Slowly, her shaking fingers picked up the jerky. She took a small bite, then a larger one. Within seconds, she was tearing at the dried meat like a starved wolf, chewing frantically, practically swallowing it whole. Silas sat on a stump across the fire, drinking from his canteen. He watched her. He had made a mistake. He knew it now. The impulse to stop the noise had saddled him with a liability. He was a solitary man. He trapped. He hunted. He survived. There was no room for softness on the mountain. There was no room for another mouth to feed, especially one that looked like it would freeze to death if a stiff breeze hit her. I'll take her to the convent in Cheyenne when the spring thaw comes, he decided. Keep her alive till then. Where I live, there ain't no neighbors, Silas spoke suddenly. The sound of his own voice startled him. Ain't no stores, just snow and rock. You do what I say when I say it, and you'll live to see the spring. Lila swallowed the last of the hardtack. She licked the crumbs from her cracked lips. She pulled the wool blanket tighter around her shoulders. I know how to work, she said. Her voice was raspy, rough from disuse. Good. I don't eat much, clearly. She fell silent again. She stared into the flames. The orange light danced across the bruises on her cheek and the deep, hollow circles under her eyes. Silas laid out his own bedroll on the other side of the fire. He didn't offer her comfort. He didn't offer her soft words. He just lay down with his rifle beside him, pulled his hat over his eyes, and slept. When he woke before dawn, she was exactly in the same position, sitting up, staring into the dying embers. She hadn't slept a wink. By noon the next day, they crossed the timberline. The trees grew sparse, twisted, and deformed by the constant wind. Above them loomed the jagged peaks of the Rockies. Nestled in a small, sheltered bowl of rock and pine stood Silas's cabin. It was small, built of heavy, unpeeled logs chinked with mud and moss. A stone chimney smoked faintly on the roof. It was rugged. It was isolated. It was home. Silas pulled the horses to a stop in front of the heavy oak door. He dismounted, tying them to a post. He walked to the mule and looked at Lila. She was exhausted, swaying in the saddle, her lips blue snow dusting her hair. We're here, he said. She climbed down, carefully wincing as her ruined feet touched the icy ground. Silas pushed the cabin door open. It creaked heavily on iron hinges. Inside the cabin was dark and smelled intensely of pine pitch wood smoke and cured leather. A small wood stove sat in the center of the room. A narrow bed covered in heavy bear hides sat in one corner. A rough wooden table and one chair sat in the other. Beaver pelts hung from the rafters, drying in the dry air. It was a man's space, utilitarian, rough, and entirely devoid of comfort. He walked in, went straight to the stove, and began stoking the embers left from his morning fire before he left. Lila stood in the doorway. She didn't cross the threshold. She hovered there, one hand gripping the doorframe, shivering violently. Shut the door, you're letting the cold in, Silas muttered, not looking up as he fed kindling into the stove. She stepped inside and pushed the heavy door shut until the latch clicked. The cabin fell into shadows, lit only by the faint light filtering through a single, grime-covered window and the orange glow of the open stove door. Silas stood up, wiping soot from his hands onto his buckskins. He looked at her. She was standing pressed back against the heavy door. She still clutched the wool blanket around her shoulders. Her eyes darted around the small room, taking in the single bed, the heavy knives sitting on the table, the sheer, trapping isolation of the space. She was waiting for it. Silas could see it in the tension in her jaw, the way she made her breathing shallow. She was waiting for the true cost of the $20 to be collected. She had been sold by a brutal man to a terrifying stranger, dragged into the frozen wilderness, cut off from the rest of the world. Silas sighed. He walked over to a wooden crate in the corner and pulled out a pair of thick wool socks and a pair of worn, soft leather moccasins. He walked over to her, and dropped them at her feet. "Put them on before you lose toes," he said. Lila looked down at the moccasins. She didn't move to pick them up. Instead, she slowly lowered the blanket from her shoulders. It fell to the floor in a heap. She stood there in her torn, threadbare dress. Silas frowned, his heavy brows pulling together. "What are you doing? I told you to put the shoes on." She reached into the deep, frayed pocket of her dress. Her hand was shaking so badly she struggled to pull out what she was holding. When she did, she didn't point it at him. She held it out on her flat palm, offering it to him. It was a jagged, filthy piece of broken glass. The edge was dark with old, dried blood. Silas looked at the glass, then up at her face. "What is that?" he asked. Lila swallowed hard. Her dead, flat eyes met his. "Mister," she said. Her voice didn't waver this time. It was terrifyingly calm. "I know what $20 buys. I ain't stupid. I know I belong to you now." Silas stared at her, the silence in the cabin suddenly deafening. "But I need to know," she continued, pushing her hand, holding the glass an inch closer to him. "When I'm done working for the day, when the floors are scrubbed and the fire is lit, do I sleep in the bed, or do I sleep on the floor?" "You can take the bed," Silas said slowly, his voice tight. "I'll sleep by the stove." Lila shook her head slightly, as if he hadn't understood. "No, mister, you don't understand." She looked down at the glass in her hand. "The old man Harlan. When he got mad, he liked to make it hurt slow. I kept this so that when he finally decided to kill me, I could finish it fast before he got his fun." She looked back up at Silas. A single tear, hot and desperate, finally broke free and tracked through the dirt on her cheek. "I'll cook, I'll clean, I won't ever speak out of turn, but I need you to tell me the truth right now. Do I throw this glass away, or do I need to keep it sharp for when winter comes?" Silas stared at the broken glass. He looked at the bruised, trembling girl, offering him her only defense, begging to know if she was a companion, a slave, or a slaughter animal. For the first time in 10 years, the mountain man felt a sharp, agonizing crack in his chest. His heart, frozen over by years of isolation and violence, shattered. Silas didn't move. He barely breathed. The heavy ticking of the metal stove, cooling and expanding, filled the suffocating silence of the cabin. He looked at the jagged shard of glass in Lila's trembling, dirt-caked palm. Then he looked at her eyes. There was no melodrama in them, no theatrics, just the chilling, pragmatic arithmetic of a woman who had calculated the exact weight of her own suffering and decided where her limit lay. Silas was a man who understood violence. He understood the brutality of a grizzly's jaw, the finality of a rifle shot, the slow, freezing death of a winter night. But this was a different kind of violence. This was a violence of the soul, inflicted by men who wore boots and drank whiskey and called themselves civilized. Slowly, Silas raised his massive, calloused hands. He kept his palms open, facing her, telegraphing every inch of his movement. "Drop it," he said. His voice was a low rumble, quieter than before. Lila's fingers tightened slightly around the base of the glass. A fresh drop of dark blood welled up where the sharp edge bit into her palm. She didn't break eye contact. "I bought you for $20. Silas said, his tone flat, stripping away any illusion. "That means I own your debts to that mud hole down there. It doesn't mean I own you. There ain't a man alive who can own another human being, no matter what paper they hold or what coin they toss." He took one deliberate step forward. Lila flinched her shoulders, jumping, but she held her ground against the door. "You sleep in the bed," Silas continued, stopping a foot away from her. "You eat what I eat. You work, because if we don't work, we freeze or we starve. The mountain doesn't care if you're a man or a woman. It just kills you if you're lazy." He reached out. He didn't grab her wrist. He didn't try to pry her fingers open. He simply cupped his large, scarred hand just below hers. "Drop the glass, Lila. You won't need it here. Not for me." She stared at his hand. It was rough, stained with pine pitch and old blood missing half of the pinky finger. It was the hand of a killer, but it was steady and it wasn't forming a fist. A violent shudder racked her thin frame. Her breathing hitched, a broken, jagged sound in her throat. Slowly, her fingers uncurled. The shard of glass fell, hitting Silas's thick leather palm with a dull clink. Silas closed his fist around it. He walked to the wood stove, opened the iron door, and tossed the glass into the red-hot embers. He slammed the door shut. The metallic clang echoed in the small room. "Put the moccasins on," Silas said, turning his back to her and walking toward the small wash basin in the corner. "There's cold water in the pitcher. Wash the mud off your face. I'll cut some meat." He didn't look back to see if she obeyed. He gave her the one thing she desperately needed in that moment: privacy. He focused entirely on taking a heavy iron skillet from the wall and slicing thick strips of salt pork behind him. He heard the soft rustle of wool, a heavy sigh, the quiet slush of water. When he finally turned around to set the skillet on the stove, Lila was sitting on the edge of the heavy timber bed. The thick moccasins swallowed her feet. The mud was scrubbed from her face, revealing pale, hollow cheeks and the stark, ugly purple of a bruised cheekbone. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the floorboards, waiting for her next order. They ate in silence. Silas set a tin plate of fried pork and beans in front of her. She ate slowly this time, her eyes darting to him every few seconds, as if expecting him to snatch the plate away. He ignored her, focusing on his own meal. When the sun finally dipped behind the peaks, plunging the cabin into a deep, freezing darkness, lit only by the stove, Silas unrolled his heavy buffalo hide sleeping bag on the hard wooden floorboards near the fire. "Go to sleep," he grunted, not looking at her. Lila lay down on the bed. She didn't pull the covers over herself. She lay stiff as a board on top of the quilt, fully dressed. Silas lay in the dark, listening to the wind begin to howl around the eaves of the cabin. It was going to be a hard winter. He listened to the shallow, uneven breathing of the girl on the bed. Hours passed. The fire burned down to a dull cherry glow. Then the whimpering started. It was a small, high-pitched sound. A trapped animal. Silas opened his eyes. In the gloom, he could see Lila thrashing on the bed. Her hands were clawing at her own throat, her head tossing violently from side to side. "No," she gasped, her voice raw. "Please, I'll scrub it again. I'll scrub it." Silas sat up. He didn't speak. He knew waking a sleeping person deep in a night terror was a good way to get a knife in the gut. He stood his bare feet silent on the floorboards and walked to the foot of the bed. She was caught in a nightmare, reliving whatever hell Harlan had put her through. She threw her arm out, striking the wooden bedpost hard. She cried out, curling into a tight ball, sobbing in her sleep. Silas reached down and grabbed the heavy woolen quilt. He pulled it up, dragging it over her shivering, curled-up form. He tucked the edges in tight, swaddling her, pinning her flailing arms safely against her sides beneath the heavy fabric. He didn't touch her skin. He didn't offer a soothing word. He just provided weight and warmth. Lila struggled against the heavy blanket for a moment. Then, slowly, the warmth seemed to penetrate the terror. Her breathing slowed. The thrashing stopped. She sank deeper into the mattress, her face relaxing into a state of exhausted oblivion. Silas stood there for a long time, watching her chest rise and fall. He turned and walked back to his hard spot on the floor. 3 weeks passed. The mountain finalized its transition from a bitter autumn into a lethal, suffocating winter. Snow piled 6 feet high against the north-facing wall of the cabin. The creek froze solid. The world outside became a blinding, hostile expanse of white. Inside the cabin, a rigid, silent routine took hold. Silas woke before dawn. He stoked the fire-boiled coffee and strapped on his snowshoes to check his trap lines in the timber below the ridge. He was gone for hours, a solitary ghost moving through the frozen pines. Lila stayed in the cabin. She worked with a frantic, desperate energy that set Silas's teeth on edge. She scrubbed the raw plank floor until her knuckles bled. She mended Silas's spare wool shirts with tight, perfect stitches. She kept the wood box endlessly full, dragging heavy logs from the covered lean-to, her breath pluming white in the freezing air. She was trying to prove her worth. She was terrified of becoming a burden. In her mind, the moment she stopped being useful was the moment Silas would drag her out into the snow and leave her to the wolves. Silas never thanked her. He never praised her. He just accepted the clean clothes and the hot meals with a curt nod. He kept his distance. He noticed she still flinched if he moved too quickly. He noticed she never sat down while he was standing. One afternoon, the sky turned the color of an old bruise. The wind stopped dead. It was an eerie, unnatural stillness that made the hair on the back of Silas's neck stand up. He was skinning a marten by the stove. He stopped his knife hovering over the carcass. He looked toward the frosted window. "Storm's coming," he muttered. "A bad one." Lila looked up from the table where she was kneading bread dough. Her hands paused. "Do we need more wood?" "Got enough for a week inside," Silas said, wiping his knife on a rag. "But I left a prime snare set up at the gorge. If I don't pull it now, the snow will bury it till spring." He stood up, grabbing his heavy buffalo coat and his rifle. "Lock the door behind me," he ordered. "Don't open it for anything but my voice." He stepped out into the biting cold. The temperature was dropping fast. The first heavy flakes of snow were beginning to fall large as silver dollars, drifting straight down in the dead air. He moved fast, his snowshoes hissing over the powder. The gorge was 2 miles away. He knew the trail blind, but the changing barometric pressure made his joints ache, specifically the deep scars on his shoulder. He reached the snare, retrieved a frozen snowshoe hair, and reset the trigger. Then the mountain exhaled. The wind hit him like a physical blow, a solid wall of moving air and ice that knocked him sideways. The whiteout was instantaneous. 1 second he was looking at a stand of dead pines. The next he couldn't see the tip of his own rifle barrel. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in 5 minutes. Silas cursed, leaning his heavy frame into the gale. He had to get back, fast. He put his head down and walked. The snow whipped into his eyes, blinding him. The wind roared a deafening physical sound that drowned out all thought. He navigated by memory and the slight upward incline of the terrain, fighting for every single step. An hour passed, then 2. He should have reached the clearing by now. His boots felt like blocks of lead. The deep, numbing cold began to seep through the buffalo hide, biting into his chest, slowing his heart. He couldn't feel his face. He stumbled over a hidden root, falling hard into a snowbank. He lay there for a moment. It was so quiet under the snow, so warm. The urge to just close his eyes for 5 minutes was overwhelming. The mountain was singing its seductive, freezing lullaby. "Get up," a voice in his head growled. "You die here. She starves in the cabin." Silas roared a sound, swallowed instantly by the wind, and forced himself to his feet. He staggered forward, blind, deaf, running entirely on the primitive instinct to endure. Suddenly, his outstretched hand hit solid wood, the cabin wall. He groped blindly along the rough logs until he felt the iron latch of the door. His fingers were useless blocks of wood. He couldn't lift the latch. He pounded on the heavy oak door with his fist. "Lila!" he roared. It came out as a weak, frozen croak. He hit the door again with the butt of his rifle. The door swung inward, violently torn from his grasp by the wind. Silas collapsed across the threshold, falling face first onto the hard wooden floor in a cascade of snow and ice. He heard the door slam shut, cutting off the shriek of the storm. Silas couldn't move. His muscles were locked. The ambient warmth of the cabin felt like boiling water against his frozen skin. He lay there, his breath rattling in his chest. Hands were on him, frantic, strong hands. Mister, get up! Lila's voice. She was pulling at his heavy buffalo coat. She couldn't lift him, so she grabbed him by the collar and used her entire body weight to drag him across the floorboards toward the roaring wood stove. I can't feel my hands. Silas slurred, his jaw locked with cold. Don't move, she ordered. The submissive, terrified girl was gone. In her place was a woman forged by hardship, recognizing a crisis she understood. Survival. She ripped the frozen buffalo coat off his shoulders. She pulled his boots off, ignoring the packed ice that sliced at her own hands. She ran to the wash basin, grabbed a towel, and dipped it in the lukewarm water near the stove. She knelt beside him. She didn't ask for permission. She took his massive, frozen hands and began to scrub them vigorously with the damp towel, working the blood back into the deadened tissue. The pain was excruciating. As the blood vessels dilated, it felt like thousands of needles were being driven into his bones. Silas groaned, trying to pull his hands away. Hold still, she snapped. Her gray eyes were fierce in the firelight. You freeze to death, I'm stuck up here. You owe me a winter, old man. Silas stopped fighting. He lay on the floor, staring up at the rough-hewn ceiling, gritting his teeth against the agonizing burn of returning circulation. She worked on his hands until they turned a raw, angry red. Then she moved to his face, gently rubbing the frost-nipped skin on his cheeks and nose. Her touch was rough, practical, completely devoid of anything but necessity. Yet it was the most profound care he had received in a decade. She grabbed a blanket from the bed and threw it over him. She poured a mug of black coffee from the pot on the stove and held it to his lips. Drink, she commanded. He drank. The scalding liquid burned down his throat, finally bringing a core of heat back to his chest. He looked at her. Her hair was a mess. Her hands were red from the ice, and she was breathing heavily. She sat back on her heels, watching him closely. You're a fool for going out in that, she said quietly. Silas managed a stiff, painful nod. Yeah, I am. For the first time since he had met her in the mud of the mining camp, the ghost of a real, genuine smirk touched the corner of Lila's mouth. Floor's hard, ain't it? She asked. Silas closed his eyes, listening to the wind tear at the roof above them. Yeah, he said. It is. The blizzard raged for 3 days. It trapped them in the small 12-by-12 box, completely isolated from the rest of the planet. The wind screamed down the stone chimney, blowing smoke back into the room, coating everything in a fine layer of ash. They existed in the glow of the wood stove. The dynamic had shifted. It wasn't a sudden, miraculous transformation into a loving couple. They were too broken for that. But the sharp, jagged edges of their cohabitation had been filed down. Silas was recovering. His hands were blistered and peeled, making fine motor tasks impossible. He couldn't chop wood, he couldn't skin a pelt, he could barely hold a fork. Lila took over. She split the logs in the lean-to. She hawed the snow to melt for water. She cooked the meals. She did it all with a quiet, relentless efficiency. On the evening of the 3rd day, the wind finally broke. The silence that followed was deafening. The pressure in the cabin vanished, leaving behind a heavy, exhausted peace. Silas sat in the single wooden chair, his bandaged hands resting on his knees. He was watching Lila. She was sitting on the floor near the stove, an awl and heavy sinew thread in her hands, repairing a tear in one of his snowshoes. She was focused. The tip of her tongue clamped between her teeth. The bruises on her face had faded to pale yellow. The hollows under her eyes were less pronounced. The regular meals of meat and fat were putting a slight softness back into her sharp angles. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was real. You're good with a needle, Silas said. His rough voice broke the long silence. Lila paused. She didn't look up, but her shoulders relaxed slightly. My ma was a seamstress in Street. Lewis taught me before the cholera took her. It was the first piece of her past she had offered freely. Silas absorbed it slowly. St. Louis, Silas mused. Long way from a mining camp in the Rockies. Lila pushed the heavy needle through the leather. My uncle took me in. He chased the silver rush, drank away the grub stake before we ever hit Denver, traded me to a tavern owner to settle a tab when I was 14. She spoke without emotion, reciting a ledger of debts and betrayals as if reading the weather report. She tied off the sinew and bit the thread clean. Harlan bought me off the tavern owner 2 years ago, she finished. She set the snowshoe down. She finally looked up at Silas. Her gray eyes were clear, reflecting the firelight. You're the third man to buy me, Silas. It was the first time she had used his name. It felt strange in the cabin, too intimate for the rough walls. Silas leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. I didn't buy you, Lila. You paid $20, she challenged softly. I paid $20 to make Harlan shut his mouth, Silas corrected. He looked down at his ruined hands. I didn't want a woman. I didn't want company. I came up this mountain to get away from people. People are liars. People take things that don't belong to them. He looked back up at her, tapping his chest right over his heart. 10 years ago, I had a wife, a farm down in the Kansas territory. A gang of jayhawkers rode through while I was in town buying seed. Burned the house. Took her. Silas's voice dropped to a gravelly whisper. I tracked them for 3 months. I killed every last one of them. But it didn't bring her back. And it didn't make the quiet go away. Lila stared at him. She looked at the jagged scar running down his neck, the hard lines of his face, the utter weariness in his eyes. She saw the monster he had become to survive his own grief. You came up here to die, she said softly. It wasn't a question. I came up here because the mountain is honest, Silas said. It freezes you, or it starves you, or a bear eats you. But it doesn't lie to your face. He leaned back in the chair. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. You asked me that first day if you should keep that glass sharp, Silas said. Lila's breath hitched slightly, remembering the cold terror of that moment. I threw it in the fire, Silas continued. But I know you. I know how survival works. I know you found another one. I know you probably keep it tucked under the mattress just in case. Lila froze. Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of panic crossing her face. Silas didn't move toward her. He didn't demand she give it up. He just looked at her with a profound, crushing sadness. I can't make you trust me, Lila. Trust is a luxury we both left down in the mud. But I promise you this. As long as there is breath in my lungs, no man will ever put a hand on you again. Not Harlan, not me, nobody. He stood up slowly, his joints popping in the cold air. He walked past her toward his bedroll by the wall. Leave the snowshoe, he said, pulling his blankets back. It's late. Lila sat by the fire for a long time after Silas's steady breathing filled the cabin. She looked at the glowing iron door of the stove. She thought about the tavern. She thought about Harlan's heavy fists. She thought about the agonizing pain of her bare feet in the snow. Then she thought about the heavy buffalo coat being wrapped around her trembling shoulders. She thought about the hot coffee. She thought about a man who killed monsters who slept on a hard floor so she could have a bed. Slowly, she stood up. She walked to the heavy timber bed. She reached her hand between the straw mattress and the wooden frame. Her fingers brushed against something cold and sharp. A jagged piece of tin she had pried from a rusty can of beans 2 weeks ago. It was razor sharp. She pulled it out. She held it in her palm, looking at the crude weapon that represented her only sense of control in a chaotic world. She walked back to the wood stove. She used a heavy leather glove to pull the iron door open. The heat blasted her face dry and intense. Lila looked at the tin shard. She looked over her shoulder at the massive bulk of the mountain man sleeping on the floorboards. She opened her hand. The piece of tin clattered into the roaring flames. She shut the iron door tight, securing the latch. She walked to the bed, lay down, and for the first time in years, she closed her eyes and simply slept. Winter broke not with a sudden rush of warmth, but with a slow, agonizing groan. Deep in the nights of late April, the ice on the creek began to fracture. It sounded like rifle shots echoing through the timber. The heavy snowpack on the cabin roof slumped and slid, hitting the ground with wet, heavy thuds. The air lost its razor edge, replaced by the damp, raw smell of decomposing pine needles and turning earth. Inside the cabin, the heavy silence of survival gave way to a different kind of quiet, a restless, suffocating tension. Silas's hands had healed. They were uglier, now webbed with shiny pink scars where the frostbite had taken its toll, but they worked. He spent his days outside stripping the winter hides, stretching beaver and marten pelts over willow hoops, and packing them tightly into bales. He was preparing for the spring trade. He was preparing to leave. Lila worked just as hard, but the frantic desperation was gone. She moved with a quiet, grounded strength. The hollows in her cheeks had filled out. Her hair, once a matted rat's nest, was washed clean with lye soap and tied back in a neat, heavy braid. She looked like a woman who belonged to the high country. But Silas remembered his promise to himself. Keep her alive till the thaw. One evening, as the last light bled over the jagged peaks, Silas carried a heavy leather saddlebag into the cabin. He dropped it onto the rough plank table. It hit with a heavy, unmistakable clinking of coin. Lila was at the stove, stirring a pot of venison stew. She didn't turn around. I'm riding down to the South Fork settlement tomorrow, Silas said, his voice flat. Practiced. Taking the pelts. There's a stagecoach that runs through there twice a month, heading to Cheyenne. Lila's wooden spoon scraped against the iron bottom of the pot, a slow, agonizing sound. She still didn't turn. There's a convent in Cheyenne. Silas continued, staring at her back. Sisters of Mercy. They take in women who've had a hard run. They'll give you a clean bed, respectable work. No men allowed on the grounds. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy pouch, dropping it next to the saddlebag. There's $200 in gold in there. It's half of what the winter catch is worth. It'll pay your board at the convent for a year and leave you enough to buy a ticket east if you want to go back to St. Louis. Lila finally stopped stirring. She set the spoon down on the iron stovetop. Slowly, she turned around. Her gray eyes were completely unreadable. The firelight flickered across her face, casting long shadows. She looked at the leather pouch on the table, then up at Silas. You're paying me off, she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact. I'm giving you a steak, Silas corrected, shifting his weight. He suddenly felt too large for the room, clumsy and suffocated. A chance to live a decent life down where it's safe. Safe. She tested the word on her tongue, finding it bitter. Like the tavern? Like the mining camp? The sisters are different. You'll be protected. By who? God. Lila let out a short, hollow laugh that didn't reach her eyes. God doesn't come above the timberline, Silas, and he sure as hell wasn't in that mud when Harlan was kicking my ribs in. You were. Silas's jaw tightened. I ain't a savior, Lila. I'm a man who kills things for a living. I live in a box of dirt and snow. This ain't a life for a woman. I'm doing what's right. Lila walked slowly to the table. She looked down at the pouch of gold. She didn't touch it. You're sending me away because I stopped being a ghost, she said quietly. As long as I was broken and terrified, you knew what to do with me. You could fix me. But now that I'm put back together, you're terrified. That's enough. Silas growled, his voice a low rumble of warning. You're terrified that if you let someone stay, the world is just going to come and burn them down again. She pushed, stepping closer to him. She didn't flinch. She didn't shrink back. You'd rather throw me away yourself than risk losing me later. Silas stared at her. The air in the cabin felt thin. He wanted to yell. He wanted to punch the log wall until his knuckles shattered. But he did nothing, because she had cut straight through his heavy buffalo coat and struck the exact, rotting core of his fear. Pack your things, Silas said. His voice was a hollow, empty shell. We ride at first light. He turned and walked out the door into the freezing spring night, leaving her alone with the gold. The journey down the mountain took 2 days. The snow melt had turned the trail into a treacherous slick of mud and loose scree. They rode in absolute silence. Silas rode point on his heavy gelding, leading the pack mule heavily laden with prime winter furs. Lila rode behind on a small bay mare he had broken for her during the spring weeks. As they descended, the air grew thick and heavy. The crisp pine scent was replaced by the smell of wood smoke, raw sewage, and unwashed bodies. They were approaching South Fork. It was larger than the nameless camp where Silas had found her, a booming supply hub for the deeper silver veins. It was a chaotic sprawl of canvas tents, false front wooden saloons, and deep, churned mud. Silas hated it immediately. His hand rested instinctively on the stock of the Winchester rifle scabbarded to his saddle. He glanced back at Lila. She sat stiffly in the saddle, her shoulders pulled tight. She wore a heavy wool coat, the collar turned up against the damp chill, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over her eyes. She was retreating into herself, building the walls back up as the noise of civilization washed over them. Keep close, Silas grunted. They waded into the main thoroughfare. Miners, drifters, and soiled doves milled about the muddy street. Wagons groaned under the weight of ore. It was loud, chaotic, and dangerous. Silas pulled up to the trading post, a heavy wooden building with a wide porch. He dismounted, tying his horse and the mule to the hitching rail. He walked back to Lila and offered his hand. She looked at it for a second, then took it, stepping down into the ankle-deep muck. Stagecoach office is down the street, the red building, Silas told her, not meeting her eyes. Go buy your ticket. Wait inside. I'll trade the pelts and bring your share. Lila didn't argue. She nodded once, turned, and began walking down the boardwalk, her boots heavy on the wet planks. Silas watched her go, a cold, heavy stone settling in his gut. He turned back to unlace the canvas from the pelts. He was halfway through untying the hitches when the shouting started. Well, I'll be a son of a bitch. Silas stopped. He didn't turn around immediately. He recognized the voice. It was slurred, wet, and cruel. He turned slowly. Standing on the boardwalk, blocking Lila's path to the stage office, was Harlan. He looked worse than he had in the autumn. His clothes were ragged, his face covered in a scabby beard, and his eyes were wild with cheap whiskey. He had 2 other men with him, hard-eyed drifters with low-slung revolvers, smelling of stale sweat and bad intentions. Harlan was staring at Lila. He took in the clean clothes, the healthy weight on her frame, the quiet strength in her posture. A sickening grin spread across his face. Look at you, Harlan sneered, taking a step toward her. Fattened up right nice. The mountain man takes good care of his property. Lila froze. The color drained from her face. Her hand instinctively drifted toward the deep pocket of her coat, but there was no shard of glass there. There was no tin lid. She had thrown them in the fire. She was unarmed. I don't belong to you, Harlan, she said, her voice shaking but defiant. The hell you don't, Harlan roared, the whiskey fueling his false courage. He paid $20, 20 for a worker. That was a lease, little girl, not a sale, and I'm collecting. He lunged forward, grabbing her roughly by the arm. Lila screamed. It wasn't the dull wail of the beaten girl in the mud. It was a sharp, furious sound of a woman fighting back. She twisted, swinging her free hand, catching Harlan across the jaw. Harlan stumbled back, shocked. Then his face twisted into a mask of pure rage. He raised his heavy, calloused fist to strike her down. "Harlan!" The word wasn't shouted. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the noise of the street like a frozen blade. Harlan's fist hovered in the air. He turned his head. Silas was standing in the middle of the muddy street. He had stepped off the boardwalk. He didn't have his rifle. He wasn't reaching for the heavy revolver on his hip. His hands hung loose at his sides, but his eyes were dead. The gray, empty eyes of a man who had already accepted the violent arithmetic of the situation. "Let her go," Silas said. Harlan sneered, emboldened by his two friends, who stepped up beside him, hands hovering near their own holsters. "You cheated me, Silas," Harlan spat. "She was worth 50. You stole her." "I'm taking her back, and I'm taking the mule for my trouble." "You ain't taking nothing but a deep breath of dirt," Silas said softly. He didn't wait for Harlan to respond. Silas moved with a terrifying, explosive speed that defied his massive size. He didn't draw a gun. A gun meant crossfire. A gun meant Lila could get hit. He closed the distance in 3 long strides, stepping onto the boardwalk. One of the drifters cursed and went for his pistol. Silas didn't even look at him. As he passed, Silas drove the heavy toe of his boot directly into the man's knee. The joint snapped with a loud crack, folding backward. The man shrieked, collapsing into the mud. Harlan panicked. He shoved Lila aside and reached for the knife at his belt. He never cleared the leather. Silas grabbed Harlan by the throat with his left hand, his scarred fingers digging into the man's windpipe, lifting him entirely off his feet. Harlan gurgled, his hands clawing uselessly at Silas's thick, leather-clad forearm. The second drifter had his gun out now, leveling it at Silas's broad back. "Drop him!" the drifter yelled. Before Silas could react, a blur of motion hit the man from the side. Lila had grabbed a heavy wooden pitchfork leaning against the trading post wall. She swung it like a baseball bat, the thick ash handle connecting solidly with the drifter's face. The man dropped like a stone, the gun firing wildly into the dirt. The street went dead silent. The townspeople froze, staring at the sudden brutal violence. Silas stood there holding Harlan in the air. Harlan's face was turning purple, his eyes rolling back in his head. Silas's face was completely devoid of anger. It was just a cold, mechanical task, eradicating a threat. "Silas." It was Lila. She dropped the pitchfork. She walked over to him, stepping over the groaning man in the mud. She put her hand on Silas's forearm. Her touch was light, steady. "Silas, look at me," she said softly. He slowly turned his head. His eyes met hers. "He's not worth it," she said. "Don't let him make you a killer today. Not for me." Silas stared at her. He felt the rapid, terrified pulse of Harlan under his fingers. He felt the cold iron of the mountain inside his chest. But looking into Lila's eyes, he felt a crack in the ice. A tiny, agonizing sliver of warmth. He opened his hand. Harlan crashed to the wooden boardwalk, coughing and gagging, curling into a pathetic ball as he gasped for air. Silas looked down at him. "If I ever see your shadow on the mountain," he said, his voice a low, vibrating hum, "I'll skin you and leave you for the crows." He turned away from the trembling man. He looked at Lila. She was breathing hard, her hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline, but she was standing tall. "Come on," Silas said. "Let's go get your ticket." The stagecoach sat in front of the red-painted office, the horses blowing steam into the damp spring air. The driver was tossing luggage onto the roof, eager to beat the fading light to the next station. Silas and Lila stood a few yards away, near the edge of the muddy street. Silas reached into his coat and pulled out the heavy leather pouch of gold. He held it out to her. "It's all there," he said. His voice was rougher than usual. He couldn't look at her face. He focused on the brass buckles of the coach's rigging. Stage leaves in 5 minutes. Takes 2 days to hit Cheyenne. Tell the sisters Silas sent you. They know me. Lila looked at the pouch in his massive, scarred hand. She didn't reach for it. The street around them was beginning to return to its chaotic rhythm. The broken men had been dragged off to the doctor. The miners were heading back to the saloons. The noise was building again into a suffocating wall of sound. You told me once, Lila started, her voice steady, that a man can't own another human being, no matter what paper they hold or what coin they toss. Silas swallowed hard. That's right. And you told me the mountain is honest. It doesn't lie to your face. Silas finally looked at her. Her gray eyes were intense, locked onto his. Down here, she continued, gesturing to the muddy street, the saloons, the distant stagecoach. Everyone is lying. Harlan lied about what I was worth. The tavern owner lied about my debts. Even you, Silas. You're lying right now. Silas frowned. I ain't lying. Yes, you are. She stepped closer to him, invading his space, ignoring the physical size of him. You're telling me you want me to get on that stage? You're telling me I'll be happier in a stone building full of nuns scrubbing floors for God instead of scrubbing them for you? Silas looked away. It's safe. I don't want safe, Silas, she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. I want honest. She reached out and pushed his hand back toward his chest, refusing the gold. I spent my whole life being traded, she said. Moved from one bad place to another because someone else decided my value. My uncle decided I was worth a few bottles of gin. Harlan decided I was worth $50. She reached into the deep pocket of her wool coat. Silas watched a momentary flash of panic hitting him. Did she keep a piece of glass after all? But she didn't pull out a weapon. She pulled out a heavy, dull coin. She pressed it into Silas's palm. Silas looked down. It was the $20 gold double eagle, the exact same coin he had thrown into the mud months ago. It was scratched and dirty, but the gold still caught the light. How? Silas started, confused. I went back into the mud the morning we left, Lila said. Harlan dropped it when he dragged me. I found it. I kept it. She looked up into his scarred, hardened face. 20, she said softly. That's the price of a life down here in the mud. So I'm buying it back. I don't owe Harlan. I don't owe the tavern. And I don't owe you. Silas stared at the coin in his hand. He felt the profound, crushing weight of what she was doing. She was stripping away the transaction. She was erasing the victimhood. If I stay, Lila said, her eyes welling with tears she refused to let fall. I stay because I choose to. I stay because I want the quiet. I stay because the only time in my miserable life I ever felt protected was sleeping on a hard wooden bed while a giant of a man slept on the floor. The driver of the stagecoach blew a sharp blast on his bugle. All aboard for Cheyenne! He hollered. Silas looked at the stagecoach. The door was open, the dark interior waiting to swallow her up and carry her away to safety, to civilization, to a world without him. He looked back at Lila. She wasn't moving toward the coach. She was standing exactly where she was, waiting for his answer, waiting for him to finally, truly see her. Silas slowly closed his fist around the gold coin. He didn't put it in his pocket. He turned and threw it with a violent snapping motion. The heavy coin sailed across the street and splashed directly into the deepest, foulest trough of mud beneath the tavern boardwalk, disappearing forever. Lila let out a breath that sounded like she had been holding for 6 months. Silas reached out. He didn't grab her arm. He didn't issue an order. He gently cupped his large, scarred hand against the side of her face. His thumb traced the line of her jaw right over where the bruises used to be. I gotta trade these pelts, Silas said, his voice a soft, broken rumble. We need flour and salt. A brilliant, breathtaking smile finally broke across Lila's face, reaching all the way to her gray eyes. Get some coffee, too, she whispered, leaning slightly into his touch. It's a long ride back up. They didn't look at the stagecoach as it rolled out of town. They turned their backs on the noise, the mud, and the lies. They walked toward the trading post, side by side, ready to return to the jagged, unforgiving, beautifully honest peaks of the high country. They weren't broken anymore. They were just two pieces of scarred iron forged together by the cold, ready to weather the storm. They left the mud and the noise behind, choosing the harsh, unforgiving truth of the mountain over the cheap lies of the world below. Silas and Lila didn't find a soft fairy tale up in that isolated cabin. They found something much harder to break. They found a partnership forged in ice and paid for not with stolen gold, but with hard-earned trust. In this land built on the promise of freedom, they chose each other not out of debt or ownership, but out of the quiet strength that only the mountains can forge. If this gritty journey into the frozen heart of the Wild West struck a chord with you, hit that like button and share this video with someone who appreciates a real, grounded story. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another tale from the frontier. Drop a comment below and tell us what was your favorite moment from Silas and Lila's journey. Until next time, keep your fire burning.